Colorado Territory, 1891. 9,000 feet above sea level, wind cutting across exposed ridges at 50 miles per hour. While every miner in camp threw up the fastest cabin possible before winter hit, Norwegian immigrant Niels Evensen was still building in late October. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He spent 3 weeks digging and stacking snow blocks into what looked like an igloo tunnel, 10 feet long, 4 feet high, leading straight to his cabin door. Other miners finished their standard single-door shacks in half the time, relying on hot stoves and tight chinking to stay warm. They laughed at his Eskimo porch, dismissing it as primitive foolishness from a man who didn't understand Rocky Mountain winters. Then, December arrived with the worst blizzard in living memory. 3 feet of snow in 18 hours. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Winds that stole your breath and turned cabins into ice boxes every time a door opened. Standard shacks bled heat so fast that families huddled around stoves that couldn't keep up. Ice formed on interior walls 3 feet from the fire. But Evensen's cabin with its snow tunnel entrance? It stayed 20 degrees warmer near the door, burning half the firewood while neighbors froze. What did this Norwegian miner understand about wind, cold air, and heat loss that experienced Rocky Mountain builders completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wind at 9,000 feet above sea level carried a bite that could freeze spit before it hit the ground, and in the autumn of 1891, it found every gap, crack, and poorly fitted board in the hastily constructed cabins scattered across the Colorado mining camp. Niels Evensen stood in the doorway of his own rough-hewn shack, watching his breath cloud in the morning air as he studied the problem that plagued every structure in camp. Each time a man opened his door to fetch firewood, check on livestock, or make the necessary trip to the privy, a blast of sub-zero air would sweep through the interior, dropping the temperature near the entrance by 10 to 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. The small box stoves that heated these single-room dwellings would roar and struggle to recover, burning through precious cordwood at an alarming rate, while the occupants huddled deeper into their blankets and cursed the Colorado weather. Evensen had arrived from Stavanger 3 years earlier with calloused hands and a head full of techniques learned through necessity in a land where winter lasted 7 months and fuel was never abundant. He had grown up in a stone farmhouse where his father banked snow against the walls each November and built wooden storm porches that broke the wind before it ever reached the main door. During his brief stint on a fishing boat, he had listened to Arctic sailors describe the ingenious design of Inuit snow houses with their low entrance tunnels that trapped cold air below the living space and kept warm air where people needed it most. These weren't abstract theories to Evensen. They were practical solutions born from generations of men and women who understood that surviving winter meant thinking like winter itself, channeling cold air where you wanted it, and keeping warm air where you lived. The Norwegian miner had spent his first Colorado winter shivering like everyone else, burning through 4 cords of firewood in a single month, and still watching ice form on the interior walls of his cabin 3 feet from the stove. But unlike his neighbors who simply accepted these conditions as the price of mountain living, Evensen began sketching ideas in the margins of his account book. He drew crude diagrams of entrance tunnels, calculated the volume of air that rushed through an open door during a 30-second trip outside, and remembered his grandfather's stories about snow caves that stayed surprisingly warm even when the wind howled across the Norwegian coast. By late October, while other miners were banking loose snow against their cabin walls and nailing scraps of canvas around door frames in a desperate attempt to seal drafts, Evenson was implementing a plan that looked like madness to anyone watching. Armed with a snow saw fashioned from an old cross-cut blade and a sturdy shovel, he began cutting dense blocks from the wind-packed drifts that had already begun accumulating on the north side of camp. These blocks, some weighing 40 pounds apiece, were remarkably solid, compressed by weeks of gale-force winds into a material that cut clean and stacked like oversized bricks. Working methodically in the face of increasingly skeptical commentary from his neighbors, Evenson first excavated a shallow trench extending 10 feet out from his cabin door. The floor of this trench dropped nearly a foot below his threshold, creating a natural cold trap where heavy, frigid air would settle rather than flowing directly into his living space. Along the sides of this excavation, he began laying the snow blocks in overlapping courses, staggering the joints like a mason building a stone wall. The side walls rose to a height of 4 feet, thick enough to provide substantial insulation, yet low enough that a man could move through the space without difficulty. The most challenging aspect of the construction was creating the roof. Evenson solved this by cutting his blocks into wedge shapes and laying them in an arch pattern, each block supporting the next as the curved ceiling took shape. Where gaps appeared between blocks, he packed them solid with loose snow, then added another layer of smaller blocks on the exterior for additional thickness. The finished walls measured 18 to 24 inches thick, a mass of trapped air and crystalline ice that would prove to be an extraordinarily effective insulator. At the outer end of this tunnel, Evenson hung a heavy wool blanket weighted with stones at the bottom edge. The fabric would fall back into place after each passage, creating an effective barrier against wind and blowing snow. At the inner end, his original cabin door remained unchanged, but now it opened into the protected environment of the tunnel rather than directly into the teeth of a Colorado gale. The reaction from his fellow miners ranged from puzzled amusement to outright derision. Hank Pritchard, the American-born shift boss who had survived a dozen Rocky Mountain winters, made it his personal mission to educate the camp about the foolishness of wasting time on elaborate doorway contraptions. "You want warmth," Pritchard would announce to anyone within earshot. "You need more firewood, not more foolishness. A door's just a door, and a hot stove makes up for any draft worth worrying about." The shift boss took particular pleasure in describing Evenson's construction project as an Eskimo railway tunnel, suggesting that the Norwegian was planning to abandon his cabin entirely and take up residence in the snow like some kind of Arctic native. Other miners, many of them young men from farming communities in the Midwest, who had never experienced anything approaching the brutal conditions of a high-altitude Colorado winter, accepted Pritchard's assessment without question. They had thrown up their cabins in 3 weeks using standard frontier techniques, single-wall log construction with gaps chinked using moss, mud, and whatever scraps of cloth they could scrounge. Extra boards nailed around door frames and gunny sacks tacked over windows constituted the extent of their weatherproofing efforts, and they were confident that these time-tested methods would prove adequate for whatever winter might bring. As November deepened and the first serious storms began building over the Continental Divide, Evenson's snow tunnel stood completed, a low white extension protruding from the front of his cabin like some kind of architectural afterthought. To the casual observer, it looked primitive, almost comical in its simplicity. But as the temperature began its relentless descent toward the sub-zero readings that would define the coming months, the Norwegian miner quietly prepared for a test that would reveal whether Old World wisdom or New World expedience would prove superior when the mountains unleashed their full fury. The first snows of December arrived with deceptive gentleness, falling in fat, lazy flakes that accumulated quietly against cabin walls and transformed the mining camp into something resembling a Christmas card. Men went about their business with the usual grumbling about cold weather, but the temperatures remained manageable and the winds stayed moderate. Hank Pritchard made a point of commenting loudly that his standard cabin was handling the winter just fine, thank you very much, and that anyone who needed to crawl through a snow tunnel to stay warm probably belonged back in whatever foreign country had taught him such foolishness. The other miners nodded their agreement, proud that they had not wasted precious time on elaborate contraptions when there was still ore to be pulled from the mountainside. But by mid-December, the weather pattern began to shift in ways that old-timers recognized with growing unease. Instead of the typical cycle of storms followed by clear, cold periods, the Pacific systems kept coming one after another, each one carrying more moisture and driving deeper into the Colorado high country than anyone had seen in recent memory. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, which had maintained reasonably reliable service to the mining districts throughout the early winter, began experiencing delays as snow accumulated faster than the crews could clear it. By December 20th, the last train pulled out of the valley and did not return, leaving the camp effectively cut off from the outside world with winter still deepening around them. The snow that had seemed manageable just weeks earlier now piled waist-deep against cabin walls, then chest-deep, forcing men to dig constantly to keep their windows from disappearing entirely beneath the white mass. Temperatures, which had hovered around 10 to 20 degrees below zero during the early storms, plunged to readings that made even experienced mountain men pause and reconsider their plans for venturing outside. The wind, always a factor at high altitude, began gusting to speeds that could knock a man down and steal his breath before he could draw it, screaming across the exposed ridges at 50 to 60 miles per hour and finding its way through every crack and gap in the hastily constructed shelters. It was under these conditions that the fundamental weakness of standard frontier cabin construction began to reveal itself in ways that no amount of bravado could mask. Every dwelling in camp shared the same basic design, a single door opening directly from the interior living space to the outside world, protected by nothing more than whatever boards, canvas, or gunny sacks the builder had managed to nail around the frame. Under normal winter conditions, this arrangement was merely inconvenient, requiring occupants to move quickly when opening the door and to accept a brief blast of cold air as the price of conducting necessary business outside. But with sustained winds of gale force and temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, the act of opening a door became a crisis that affected the entire interior of the cabin. The physics of the situation were brutally simple. Warm air inside the cabin was lighter than the frigid air outside, and when a door opened during high winds, the pressure differential created by the moving air mass would suck the heated interior air out like a chimney in reverse, while simultaneously driving a blast of sub-zero wind directly into the living space. The result was an immediate and dramatic temperature drop that could affect areas 15 to 20 feet from the door, scattering ashes from fireplaces, rattling cookware hanging from nails, and chilling anyone unlucky enough to be sleeping or sitting in the direct path of the wind. Dr. Clara Miller, the camp's only trained physician, began documenting the pattern as she made her rounds to treat cases of frostbite, pneumonia, and the persistent coughs that seemed to plague anyone living in the drafty cabins. Her medical training had taught her to observe and record, and what she observed was a direct correlation between housing conditions and the health of her patients. Men living in the standard cabins were burning through their firewood supplies at an alarming rate, yet still struggling to maintain temperatures warm enough to prevent water from freezing in buckets set near the door. Children and elderly residents were particularly vulnerable, developing respiratory ailments that seemed to worsen in direct proportion to the number of times family members were forced to open their doors during the worst weather. The bachelor miners, men living alone in single-room shacks, faced perhaps the most difficult situation. Every trip outside for firewood, Every journey to check on animals or make necessary visits to the camp's communal facilities required opening their door and accepting the immediate consequence of watching their hard-won interior warmth disappear in a matter of moments. Some attempted desperate measures, nailing additional boards over their doors and cutting smaller openings that could be closed more quickly, but these modifications often jammed as snow accumulated and shifted around the frame. Others tried constructing makeshift windbreaks from scrap lumber and tar paper, but these flimsy structures invariably collapsed under the weight of wet, heavy snow before they could be properly braced and secured. One miner attempted to solve the problem by building a quick wooden enclosure around his door, working frantically during a brief lull in the storm to nail together a crude porch from whatever materials he could scrounge. But mountain weather showed no mercy for hasty construction, and within 48 hours, the improvised roof had collapsed under a load of snow that the inadequate framing simply could not support. The man found himself not only back where he started, but actually worse off, with a pile of broken lumber blocking his doorway and no materials left for a second attempt. As the storms continued to intensify and the isolation of the camp became complete, word began to spread quietly among the miners about conditions in various cabins around the settlement. The stories were whispered rather than announced openly, as no one wanted to admit that their standard construction methods might be inadequate. But the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Men were burning through winter fuel supplies at twice the expected rate, yet still waking to find frost formed on the interior surfaces of their doors and ice skimming over water buckets that had been set close to the stove. The proud assertions about proven frontier techniques began to sound increasingly hollow as the true test of high-altitude winter survival played out in the thin air and howling winds of the Colorado Rockies. The breaking point came during the final week of December, when a storm system of unprecedented ferocity settled over the high country and refused to move on. For 3 consecutive days, snow fell at rates that buried landmarks and transformed familiar paths into anonymous white expanses, while winds that had been merely dangerous escalated to velocities that could physically move a grown man against his will. Inside the standard cabins, the battle for warmth had become a losing proposition that no amount of additional firewood could remedy. Eli Brown, a young carpenter miner from Ohio, who had arrived the previous spring confident in his ability to build adequate shelter using techniques learned from his father, found himself facing a crisis that his Midwest upbringing had never prepared him to handle. Each morning he would wake to discover that the interior door planks of his cabin had developed a coating of frost so thick it looked like deliberate decoration, formed by his own breath condensing and freezing on the wood throughout the night. The water bucket he kept beside his bed, positioned close enough to the stove that he could reach it without leaving his blankets, would be skimmed with ice despite the box stove burning continuously just 8 feet away. Brown's situation was being replicated throughout the camp, but with variations that reflected each man's particular circumstances and the adequacy of his preparations. A family of 4 that included 2 young children had been forced to abandon their sleeping arrangements near the door after the youngest developed a persistent cough that worsened each time someone opened the door to venture outside. They moved their bedding into the center of the single room and began burning firewood at a rate that consumed their carefully calculated winter supply far ahead of schedule, yet still found themselves huddled under every available blanket while their breath formed visible clouds in the interior air. The bachelor miners faced perhaps the most acute version of the crisis, as they had no one with whom to share the burden of maintaining heat while conducting the necessary business of survival. One grizzled prospector who had boasted about surviving 15 Colorado winters found himself developing early-stage frostbite on his fingers, not from exposure while working outside, but from the repeated shock of frigid air that blasted through his cabin each time he opened the door to retrieve firewood from the pile he had stacked against the exterior wall. His small stove, adequate for normal conditions, simply could not recover quickly enough from the heat loss to maintain livable temperatures in the face of the constant wind infiltration. The social dynamics of the camp began to shift as men who had been proud of their self-sufficiency found themselves facing the uncomfortable reality that their standard methods were failing them when they needed them most. Hank Pritchard, the shift boss who had been most vocal in his criticism of elaborate building techniques, discovered that his own cabin was bleeding heat so rapidly that he had taken to sleeping fully clothed, including his boots, so that he could tend the fire throughout the night without exposing himself to the numbing cold that had settled into every corner of his supposedly adequate shelter. The gaps between his logs, chinked with moss and mud in the traditional manner, had proven woefully inadequate against the sustained assault of sub-zero wind, and frost was creeping along the interior walls in patterns that marked the path of every draft. Dr. Clara Miller, making her rounds despite conditions that made travel between cabins genuinely dangerous, began to document the medical consequences of the housing crisis with the systematic precision of her professional training. She carried 2 simple spirit thermometers in her medical bag, and at each cabin she visited, she would take readings both near the door and near the stove to quantify what her patients were experiencing. The measurements told a story that was as clear as it was alarming. In cabin after cabin, temperatures near the door were running 15 to 20 degrees colder than temperatures near the heat source, creating zones within single-room dwellings where hypothermia became a genuine risk for anyone who lingered too long in the wrong location. Her most disturbing case was an elderly miner named Tom Garrett, who lived alone in a shack that had seemed adequate during the milder weather of early winter. Garrett had developed what appeared to be the early stages of pneumonia, but Miller's examination revealed that the condition was being exacerbated by his living situation rather than by exposure to outdoor conditions. Every few hours, Garrett was forced to open his door to retrieve firewood, and each time he did so, the temperature near his sleeping area would plummet so dramatically that his body never had the opportunity to fully recover from the previous cooling cycle. Miller found ice formations on the interior walls of his cabin extending more than 4 feet from the door, in a dwelling where the stove was burning continuously and consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. The improvised solutions that had seemed reasonable during the planning stages of winter were revealing themselves to be wholly inadequate under the extreme conditions now prevailing. Extra boards nailed over door frames were splitting under the thermal stress of repeated expansion and contraction, creating new gaps that were actually worse than the original openings. Canvas and oilcloth tacked around doorways was tearing loose under the assault of wind-driven snow, flapping uselessly while offering no protection whatsoever against the infiltration of cold air. Gunny sacks stuffed into gaps between logs were freezing solid and then shrinking, opening cracks that had not existed before the attempted repairs. Some miners attempted more desperate measures, trying to create buffer zones by hanging blankets inside their cabins or constructing interior partitions from available materials, but these efforts only succeeded in reducing the already limited living space while providing minimal improvement in temperature control. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Every time a door opened directly from the heated interior to the storm outside, the physics of air pressure and thermal dynamics would inevitably result in a massive loss of the warmth that was so difficult and expensive to generate. As word spread through the camp about the varying degrees of success and failure that different miners were experiencing, attention began to turn toward the one cabin that seemed to be weathering the crisis with inexplicable success. Rumors circulated in whispers rather than open conversation, as no one wanted to admit that they might have misjudged the Norwegian miners' strange construction project. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. While standard cabins throughout the camp were consuming firewood at rates that threatened to exhaust winter supplies before February, and while men were waking to frost-covered walls and ice-skimmed water buckets, the shack with the peculiar snow tunnel entrance appeared to be maintaining comfortable conditions with fuel consumption that seemed almost impossibly modest. The curiosity about Niels Evanson's seemingly impossible fuel efficiency finally overcame the social awkwardness of admitting error when Eli Brown approached the Norwegian's cabin during a brief lull in the storm, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but actually to investigate the rumors that had been circulating through the camp. What Brown discovered as he approached the peculiar snow tunnel entrance was his first education in the physics of wind and thermal dynamics, though he would not have recognized it by those terms. Standing at the outer opening of the tunnel, Brown could hear the storm raging overhead and feel the bite of wind-driven snow against his exposed face. But the moment he pushed through the weighted wool blanket that served as the outer door, the assault of moving air ceased almost entirely. The tunnel interior was undeniably cold. His breath still formed visible clouds in the still air, but the cutting quality of the wind was completely absent, replaced by a peculiar quietness that seemed to muffle even the sound of the storm outside. The floor of the tunnel sloped gently upward from the entrance toward the cabin door, and Brown noticed that the coldest air seemed to pool in the lower section near the entrance, while slightly warmer air rose toward the actual living space. When Evanson opened his cabin door to greet his visitor, Brown experienced something that defied his expectations based on his own recent struggles with heat loss. The warm air from the cabin interior did not come rushing out to meet the cold air of the tunnel, creating the violent mixing and immediate temperature drop that characterized every door opening in the standard cabins throughout camp. Instead, the warm air rose gently and remained largely contained within the cabin space, while the cold air in the tunnel stayed put in its lower position, creating distinct thermal layers that remained surprisingly stable even with the door standing open. Evanson invited Brown inside and demonstrated the system with the methodical precision of a man who had thought carefully about every aspect of his design. He had positioned two simple spirit thermometers in his cabin, one just inside the door that opened to the tunnel and another near his box stove. During Brown's visit, Evanson stepped outside through the tunnel system twice to retrieve firewood, leaving the inner door open for roughly 30 seconds each time, while he maneuvered the split logs through the entrance. The thermometer near the stove showed virtually no change, dropping perhaps 2 degrees during the entire process, while the thermometer near the door registered a decline of only 5 to 6 degrees before quickly recovering as the warm air redistributed itself throughout the cabin. Brown asked if he could conduct his own test using the same method he had been forced to employ in his own cabin, and Evanson agreed with the quiet confidence of a man whose system had been tested thoroughly under the most demanding conditions. When Brown opened his own cabin door for the same duration and under similar weather conditions, the temperature near his door plummeted from 42 degrees to 23 degrees in less than a minute, while the area near his stove dropped from 51 degrees to 38 degrees. His box stove immediately began roaring as the draft created by the open door fed more air to the fire, but the increased combustion could not compensate for the massive volume of heated air that had been sucked out of the cabin and replaced by frigid outside air. The difference in fuel consumption became apparent through simple observation rather than complex calculation. Evenson's woodpile, visible through the tunnel entrance, appeared to be lasting far longer than similar supplies throughout the camp, despite the fact that he was maintaining interior temperatures that seemed more comfortable than those achieved in cabins that were burning wood at twice the rate. The explanation lay in the fundamental principle that Evanson had unconsciously applied. Preventing heat loss was far more efficient than generating additional heat to replace what had been lost. Dr. Clara Miller, who had been documenting the medical consequences of inadequate heating throughout the camp, requested permission to take detailed temperature measurements in Evenson's cabin as part of her informal study of the relationship between housing conditions and health outcomes. Her measurements revealed that the Norwegians' living space maintained remarkably consistent temperatures throughout, with variations of only 8 to 10 degrees between the warmest and coldest areas of the single room. This thermal stability extended to the area immediately inside the door, where other cabins were experiencing temperature swings of 20 to 30 degrees with each opening. Miller's medical training had taught her to look for patterns and correlations, and what she observed in Evenson's cabin was a direct contrast to the conditions she was treating throughout the rest of the camp. The air quality was noticeably better, with less of the sharp, dry quality that characterized overheated cabins where stoves were being pushed beyond their design capacity to compensate for constant heat loss. The absence of dramatic temperature fluctuations meant that moisture levels remained more stable, reducing the condensation and subsequent ice formation that was plaguing other dwellings. The social implications of these discoveries created a subtle but significant shift in the camp's dynamics. Men who had been vocal in their criticism of Evenson's construction methods found themselves asking quiet, practical questions about dimensions, materials, and construction techniques. The inquiries were phrased carefully to avoid the appearance of admitting error, but the intent was unmistakable. They wanted to understand how to replicate the system that was clearly outperforming everything else in the camp. Hank Pritchard, the shift boss who had been most dismissive of the snow tunnel concept, approached Evenson with the kind of studied casualness that indicated a significant swallowing of pride. His questions focused on structural details. How thick were the tunnel walls? How had Evenson prevented the roof from collapsing? And what techniques had he used to ensure that the snow blocks would hold together under the weight of additional snowfall? Pritchard framed these inquiries as general curiosity about foreign building methods, but his notebook appeared during the conversation, and he took detailed notes about angles, dimensions, and construction sequences. Other miners began arriving at Evenson's cabin with increasing frequency, ostensibly for routine social visits, but actually to experience firsthand the comfortable conditions that had become the subject of camp-wide speculation. The Norwegian received these visitors with the understated courtesy that characterized his interactions throughout his time in Colorado, offering hot coffee and simple explanations of his building techniques without any suggestion of superiority or vindication. He described his methods in practical terms that emphasized the logical progression of problem solving rather than any particular brilliance on his part, frequently crediting techniques learned from his father and stories told by Arctic sailors for the concepts that had guided his design. The snow tunnel had become more than just an unusual architectural feature. It had evolved into a proof of concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about frontier building practices and demonstrated that traditional methods, no matter how widely accepted, could be improved through the application of knowledge gained in different climates and conditions. The night of January 3, 1892, brought a storm that surpassed even the brutal conditions the camp had endured throughout December. The wind velocity reached levels that experienced mountain men had never witnessed, howling across the exposed ridges with such force that it seemed to shake the very bedrock beneath the mining claims. Snow fell not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, driven by gusts that exceeded 70 miles per hour and created whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible beyond a distance of 10 feet. The temperature plunged to 38 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze human tissue in minutes and turn exhaled breath into ice crystals before it could dissipate. In his standard cabin, Tom Garrett fought a losing battle against conditions that had overwhelmed his heating system entirely. Despite burning wood continuously for 18 hours, his box stove could not generate enough heat to prevent ice from forming on the interior surfaces of his walls, and the water in his wash basin had frozen solid despite being positioned within 4 feet of the fire. Garrett himself was showing early signs of hypothermia, his speech becoming slurred and his movements increasingly clumsy as his core body temperature dropped below safe levels. Around midnight, as his vision began to blur and his judgment became impaired by the cold, Garrett made the decision that would save his life. He wrapped himself in every blanket he owned, pulled his wool hat down over his ears, and stumbled out into the storm toward the only cabin in camp that seemed to offer genuine refuge. The journey from Garrett's door to Evanson's tunnel entrance required only about 60 yards of travel, but in the howling darkness of the blizzard, it became an exercise in survival navigation. Garrett followed the rope guidelines that the miners had strung between buildings earlier in the winter, feeling his way hand over hand through snow that reached his chest and wind that threatened to knock him down with each step. When he finally located the wool blanket that marked the entrance to Evanson's tunnel, he pushed through it with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope. The immediate relief from wind was so dramatic that Garrett paused for several seconds just inside the tunnel entrance, allowing his body to register the absence of the cutting air movement that had been assaulting him for hours. The temperature inside the tunnel was undeniably cold, but it was a still, manageable cold that did not steal his breath or force ice crystals into his lungs with each inhalation. As he made his way up the gentle slope toward the inner door, Garrett could feel the air warming perceptibly with each step, rising from the brutal sub-zero conditions outside to something approaching tolerable. When Evanson opened his cabin door in response to Garrett's knock, the older miner was struck immediately by the wall of warm air that greeted him, carrying the scents of coffee, pipe tobacco, and properly seasoned firewood. The interior of the cabin felt genuinely warm rather than merely less cold, and Garrett realized that his host was sitting comfortably in his shirt sleeves, while outside, men were freezing in their fully clothed sleep despite continuous fires. Evanson welcomed Garrett without fanfare, helping him remove his ice-encrusted outer garments and positioning him near the stove with a cup of hot coffee and a bowl of venison stew that had been simmering on the stove top. Within an hour, 2 more miners had made the same desperate journey through the storm, arriving at Evanson's door with the hollow-eyed look of men who had been losing the battle against conditions beyond their experience. The Norwegian accommodated each arrival without complaint, clearing sleeping space on his floor and hanging additional blankets over the inner door to provide extra insulation against any heat loss through the tunnel system. By dawn, 5 men were crowded into the single-room cabin, yet the temperature remained comfortable and the air quality stayed breathable because the tunnel entrance prevented the dramatic heat loss that would have resulted from multiple door openings in a standard cabin. The storm continued for 2 more days, during which time Evanson's cabin became an informal shelter for anyone whose own heating system had been overwhelmed by the unprecedented conditions. The Norwegian never suggested that his guests were incompetent or that their construction methods were inadequate. Instead, he explained his tunnel system in the practical terms of a craftsman sharing techniques with fellow workers. He described the physics of cold air settling in low places while warm air rose, the insulating properties of snow when properly compacted and contained, and the wind-breaking effect of any barrier placed between moving air and a heated space. Dr. Clara Miller, who had made the dangerous journey to check on patients throughout the camp, spent considerable time documenting the contrast between conditions in Evanson's sheltered cabin and the crisis situation she was treating elsewhere. Her measurements showed that while other cabins were struggling to maintain interior temperatures above freezing despite consuming wood at unsustainable rates, the tunnel-equipped dwelling was maintaining a steady 55 to 60 degrees throughout the living space while using approximately 40% less fuel than comparable structures. When the storm finally passed, and the men who had sheltered with Evanson returned to assess their own cabins, They found ice damage that would have been far worse if they had remained and continued trying to heat spaces that were bleeding warmth faster than it could be generated. Garrett's cabin, in particular, showed the consequences of inadequate thermal protection. Frost had penetrated so deeply into the interior walls that it would take days of careful heating to prevent structural damage from the freeze-thaw cycles that would occur as temperatures gradually rose. The conversations that took place around Evenson's stove during those 3 days of enforced cohabitation were not about vindication or superiority, but about practical knowledge transfer from men who had learned hard lessons to men who were eager to avoid repeating those lessons. Hank Pritchard, his earlier skepticism completely abandoned in the face of measurable results, took detailed notes about construction techniques, asking specific questions about snow density, wall thickness, entrance angles, and the positioning of cold traps. Eli Brown sketched diagrams of the tunnel system and calculated the labor hours that would be required to build similar structures around his own cabin and others throughout the camp. The storm had provided a definitive test of building techniques under the most extreme conditions that Colorado high country could deliver, and the results were unambiguous. Standard frontier cabin construction, adequate for normal winter conditions, had proven inadequate when subjected to sustained assault by wind, snow, and sub-zero temperatures. The unconventional approach that had been dismissed as foreign foolishness had not only survived the test but had provided refuge for men whose more conventional methods had failed them completely. As word of the successful shelter spread throughout the surviving mining camps in the region, the snow tunnel concept began its transformation from curiosity to accepted technique, carried by men whose lives had been saved by the willingness of one Norwegian immigrant to trust traditional knowledge over local custom.